Hello students, today we will start this chapter. But first we will start with the introduction of this term, that is friction. You must have observed in your daily life, bache, when you throw a ball on the ground, it gradually stops after some time. जब भी हम बच्चे को एक बॉल रोल करते हैं सरफेस पर, ग्राउंड पर, तो बॉल पहले धीरे धीरे स्लो होती है, इट ग्रेजुअली स्लोज डाउन एंड अल्टीमेटली स्टॉप्स. और अल्टीमेटली क्या हो जाती है? रुक जाती है. नेक्स्ट, इफ यू आर बाइसाइक्लिंग, इफ यू आर साइक्लिंग, देन इफ यू स्टॉप पेडलिंग the bicycle gradually slows down and ultimately stops. हम बच्चे अगर बाइसाइकिल राइड कर रहे हैं on the moving ball which stops its motion, which opposes its motion. Oppose means विरोध करना, जो उसकी खिलाफत करती है, and that opposing force is known as friction. So what is friction, बच्चे? It is a force which comes into acts when two objects are in direct contact with each other, when two surfaces are in direct contact with each other and one object is moving over the other. फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स क्या है बच्चे? एक ऐसा फोर्स है जो दो सरफेसेस के बीच में लगता है, वो दो सरफेस जो एक दूसरे के डायरेक्ट कांटेक्ट में है और एक ऑब्जेक्ट, एक सरफेस दूसरे के ऊपर मूव कर रहा है, वो उसके ऊपर मोशन में है, then that force, that opposing force is known as friction. So what is friction, bache? It is the force acting along the two surfaces in direct contact which opposes the motion of one object over the other is known as friction or force of friction. It is also known as frictional force. So that is the force of friction or frictional force. In most simple words, you can say the force which opposes the motion when the two surfaces are in direct contact. That force is known as frictional force. जब बच्चों दो सरफेस एक दूसरे के डायरेक्ट कांटेक्ट में हैं और एक ऑब्जेक्ट दूसरे के रिस्पेक्ट में मोशन में है, तो जो फोर्स मोशन को अपोज करेगा, जो फोर्स मोशन के अगेंस्ट होगा, दैट फोर्स इज नोन एज फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन और फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स. नेक्स्ट विल स्टडी कॉज ऑफ फ्रिक्शन. व्हाट इज द रीजन बिहाइंड दिस फोर्स? व्हाट इज द कॉज ऑफ फ्रिक्शन? क्या कारण है फ्रिक्शन का? द कॉज ऑफ द फ्रिक्शन इज द रफनेस और इर्रेगुलरिटीज ऑफ अ सरफेस. Every surface, whether it's a smooth surface or a rough surface, has certain irregularities. This is a wall, a painted wall. It has certain irregularities over it. If we want to increase those irregularities, then we take a sandpaper and by the help of sandpaper, we make it more rough. So, the roughness can be increased or decreased by various methods. But that roughness of a surface is the cause of force of friction for that particular surface. More the roughness of a surface, more irregularities on the surface, that means it produces more friction, and less the irregularities means it produces less friction. If you can clearly observe the surface of a whiteboard, it appears to you a very smooth surface. But still, if you want to see the irregularities of that smooth surface, you have to use a microscope. Microscope magnifies the image. अगर हम बच्चे इसे मैग्नीफाई करके देखेंगे तो हम देखेंगे इसमें भी irregularities हैं. And those irregularities are seen in the form of hills and valleys. The example of that is, you take a wooden block, and that wooden block is moved or rubbed over a wooden table. You can use a glass table as well. But if you use a glass table instead of wooden, then there will be scratches on the glass. Now, suppose I am pushing or pulling that wooden block in this direction. So the force of action is in this direction, that is towards the left or if you are watching the screen, then towards the right of your screen, bache. This is the direction of force. The applied force is in this direction. Then the force of friction will act in the opposite direction. So, force of friction is always opposite in the direction of applied force. Due to this, you may see some scratches, you may see certain heat, you may see certain sound produced by that rubbing. So, that is what due to friction. Now, this is the wooden table sort of thing, a wooden cardboard, and this is a wooden block, If I used to move this wooden block on this cardboard, then my direction of applied force is from my right hand towards my left hand, whereas the force of friction which exerts on this wooden block will be from my left hand towards my right hand. So, if I am moving it from this side to this, then the frictional force will be exerted from this side to that side. So, force of friction is always directed opposite to the direction of motion, due to which this block will not move on its own, bache. Why? Because the force of friction does not allow that object to move. So, this is the activity which we will doing on this topic. Now, bache, if we magnify that thing and observe it, then bache, the two surfaces are like this. This is the upper surface, that is the surface of the wooden block, and the lower one is the surface of wooden table. Like this is the surface of wooden table, and this one is the surface of wooden block which we are moving over that table. And if you look closely, these are the irregularities, these are the hills and the valleys which are formed on this surface, which are not formed, which are present on this surface. When bache, we bring these together and they will, rubbed over each other, then these gaps interlocked with each other. These hills and valleys gets interlocked with each other, and due to the interlocking, a friction is generated. It would be not very easy for us to move this, wooden block on the wooden table. Or you can say does not move on its own, because a frictional force always stops its motion. So the cause of friction is these irregularities, these hills and valleys which are present on the surfaces of these two. Likewise, if a ball is rolling on the ground, then ground has certain irregularities and ball surface also has certain irregularities. Both the irregularities will interlock with each other, and henceforth the ball will be stopped. Likewise, the tires of a bicycle has irregularities, has certain grooves, as well as the road on which the bicycle is moving has certain irregularities. Both the irregularities will come in contact with each other, and henceforth this bicycle stops when we stop pedaling. Now we'll discuss the types of friction. Frictional force or friction is of three types. First is static friction, the second is limiting friction, and the third is kinetic friction. As the name indicates, static means stable, which is not moving. The body is at rest. The frictional force which acts along the two objects which acts along the surfaces of two objects when one object is placed over the other and that is at rest. The other object tends to move, wants to move, but due to frictional force that object is not moving. For example, बच्चे, if I place this marker at the top of this board, there is a frictional force exerted on that marker due to which that marker is not moving, and that frictional force which brings that marker, which takes or which kept that marker at rest is known as static friction. This marker tends to move, but due to frictional force of this board, this do not move over it. The second is limiting friction. In most simple words, maximum value of static friction is known as limiting friction. Suppose this marker is placed at the top of this board. I am slightly pushing it. I am applying force, but that marker still not moves. होता भी ऐसा बच्चे, अगर मैं इस बोर्ड को पुश करना चाहता हूं, इसे हिलाना चाहता हूं, तो धीरे धीरे अगर मैं पुश करूंगा तो ये मूव नहीं होगा. फिर मैं उस फोर्स को इंक्रीज करूंगा. You must have observed in your life, if there is a almirah, there is a cupboard is placed at your house. If mama wants to move it, mama only single-handedly cannot be able to move it. Then she called you or your brother or your father to help her out. Why? Because mother wants to increase the force which can oppose the frictional force. So a maximum value of frictional force at which the object just at the verge of motion, जहां पर बस ऑब्जेक्ट चलने ही वाला है, that maximum value of static friction or that maximum value of force is known as limiting friction. बच्चे वैसे धीरे धीरे पुश करता जा रहा हूं, ये मूव नहीं हो रहा, लेकिन अब मैंने जब इसको पुश किया तो अब ये मूव होने लगा है. क्यों होने लगा है? क्योंकि मैंने अपना फोर्स फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स से ज्यादा लगा दिया. जो मैंने फोर्स लगाया वो इधर है, फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स इस तरफ था, फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स कम था और मेरा फोर्स ज्यादा, तो मार्कर क्या होने लगा? मूव. सो दैट फ्रिक्शन एट विच द ऑब्जेक्ट इज एट द वर्ज ऑफ मोशन, वर्ज मीन्स बस मूव होने ही वाला है, दैट फ्रिक्शन इज नोन एज लिमिटिंग फ्रिक्शन. सो लिमिटिंग फ्रिक्शन इज एक्चुअली the maximum value of static friction. जो limiting friction है वो क्या है बच्चों? Maximum value है किसकी? Static friction की. Now we'll explain, we'll understand this activity to understand the topic of static friction and limiting friction. Suppose this is the wooden block placed over this wooden cardboard. This block is at the rest, is at static position. It's stable, neither moving on this side nor on that side. So the friction which hold it state and the similar rest state, that friction is static friction. But if I will start pushing it, if I start applying a force at a fixed value of force, it just starts to move. The value of force at which it just starts to move, that force is known as limiting friction. So, limiting friction is the maximum value of static friction. The third form of friction is kinetic friction. The word kinetic is related to motion or movement. The frictional force which acts between the two objects, which acts between the surfaces of two objects when one object is actually moving over the other. बच्चे इन दोनों फ्रिक्शन में क्या था? इसमें तो ऑब्जेक्ट रेस्ट पर ही था, इसमें बस वो वर्ज ऑफ मोशन पर है, बस वो चलने ही वाला है, बट इसमें बचे ऑब्जेक्ट क्या है, एक्चुअली मूव हो रहा है. सो द फोर्स ऑफ फ्रिक्शन which acts between the two objects when one object is moving over the other, that friction is known as kinetic friction. This friction is subdivided into two forms. The first one is sliding friction and other one is rolling friction. What is sliding friction? The frictional force which acts between the surfaces of two objects when one object actually slides over the other. जब एक ऑब्जेक्ट बच्चे दूसरे के ऊपर स्लाइड करता है, they just slide over each other, then the frictional force which exerts is known as sliding friction. You must have done in winters, rub your hands so that your hands feel warm. Winters में हम क्या करते हैं बच्चे, अपने हाथों को रब करते हैं. Why? So that when we rub one surface with the other, then due to friction heat can be generated, and due to that heat our hands feel warm. So that is the sliding friction. We are sliding our hand on the other one. The other one is rolling friction. As its name indicates, bache, when an object is in the direct contact with other surface, with other object, and rolls over the other, the friction which is exerted on that rolling is known as rolling friction. The ball rolls over a surface, bache, due to which it stops after covering a particular distance. That friction is known as rolling friction. Now we'll discuss the sliding and rolling friction by small activity. This is a marker, bache. If I place this marker on this cardboard and slide it over that cardboard, then the friction which is exerted over this marker, over this whiteboard marker, is known as sliding friction. As I am sliding it over the surface, so the friction which is exerted, due to which, if you can hear, a sound is also producing, bache. That sound is producing due to friction between the slide of this marker on this cardboard. If I remove the cap and allows that marker to roll over it, as you can see, this is rolling over it, and after rolling it stops. This friction which is related to this rolling of this marker on the surface is known as rolling friction. If tilt the cardboard, then it will move on the other side, and after some time it stops. I didn't stop it, but it stops on its own. Why? Because the frictional force is exerted between this and this marker. So when it rolls over it, the frictional force is rolling friction. When it slides over it, then the frictional force exerted, it is known as sliding friction. Now we will discuss the definition, the proper definitions of all types of friction. As we know, bache, the friction is of three types: static, limiting, and kinetic friction. The first one is static friction. The opposing force that comes into play when one object tends to move over the other, but still there is no motion in between them, but still that object is at rest. That motion is known as that friction is known as a static friction. वो फ्रिक्शनल फोर्स बचे जो दो ऑब्जेक्ट्स के बीच में लग रहा है जब एक ऑब्जेक्ट दूसरे के ऊपर मूव करना चाहता है बट अभी मूव कर नहीं रहा है. That frictional force is known as static frictional force. The frictional force which acts between the two objects when one object tends to move, wants to move on the surface of other, but actually it is not moving. That force is known as, that frictional force is known as static frictional force. The second one is limiting friction. It is the maximum opposing force acts between the two objects that comes into play when the two objects are in direct contact and one object just at the verge of motion over the other. ये वो मैक्सिमम ऑपोजिंग फोर्स है जिस पर बच्चे एक ऑब्जेक्ट बस बिल्कुल मूव करने ही वाला है. एग्जांपल समझें. मान लो बच्चे मेरे हैंड पर इस मार्कर ने मूव करना है. इस मार्कर को मूव होने के लिए सपोज 20 न्यूटन फोर्स चाहिए. मैं फोर्स लगा रहा हूं बच्चे अपनी फिंगर से 5 न्यूटन 10 न्यूटन, तो ये मूव होगा? नो. जब 20 न्यूटन फोर्स चाहिए बच्चे तो 5 और 10 पर ये मूव नहीं हो सकता. तो बच्चे मैंने 5 लगाया, 10 लगाया, 15 लगाया, ये मूव नहीं हो रहा. बट एज आई अप्लाई 20 न्यूटन द एग्जैक्ट फोर्स, द मैक्सिमम ऑपोजिंग फोर्स ड्यू टू विच इट जस्ट स्टार्ट्स टू मूव, दैट इज नोन एज लिमिटिंग फ्रिक्शन. उसे हम क्या बोलते हैं? लिमिटिंग फ्रिक्शन. नेक्स्ट, kinetic friction, the most important among the three. What is kinetic friction? It is the opposing force that comes into play when one object actually moves over the other. That frictional force is known as kinetic frictional force, or that friction is known as kinetic friction. जब एक ऑब्जेक्ट बच्चे दूसरे ऑब्जेक्ट पर एक्चुअली मूव कर रहा है, then the force of friction between those two objects is known as kinetic friction. It is of two types. The first one is sliding, another one is rolling. What is sliding friction? The opposing force that comes into play when one object slides over the another object, that is known as a sliding friction. जब बच्चे एक ऑब्जेक्ट दूसरे पर स्लाइड करता है, घिसता है, उसे हम क्या बोलते हैं? स्लाइडिंग फ्रिक्शन. The opposing force when an object slides over the surface of another object, then that frictional force is known as sliding frictional force. For example, I have a log of wood. मेरे पास एक log of wood है, मैंने उसको थ्रेड से बांध कर मैं उसे खींच रहा हूं, उसे स्लाइड कर रहा हूं. That is known as the frictional force that applies between the two surfaces is known as sliding friction. Next is rolling friction. The opposing force that comes into play when one object actually rolls over the other, that friction is known as rolling friction. Rolling friction is always less than the sliding friction. That is why in our general life we convert sliding friction into rolling friction. Like the heavy appliances like desert coolers are fitted with the stands which has rollers below it. बच्चे आपने देखा होगा जो डेजर्ट कूलर्स होते हैं उनके नीचे का जो स्टैंड होता है, डेजर्ट कूलर के नीचे आजकल क्या लगाने लगे हैं? रोलर्स लगाने लगे हैं. क्यों? अगर बच्चे वो बिल्कुल सिंपल प्लेन बॉक्स होगा तो उसे स्लाइड करना पड़ेगा, और स्लाइडिंग फ्रिक्शन रोलिंग फ्रिक्शन से क्या होता है? ज्यादा. तो उसे खींचना इतना आसान नहीं होगा. लेकिन अगर उसके नीचे आप रोलर लगा लोगे तो आप अकेले भी उसे बड़ी आसानी से इधर उधर ले जा सकते हो. एज रोलिंग फ्रिक्शन इज लेस देन sliding friction. So this is the types of friction along with their definitions.